I've kind of formed a mission statement over the last few days of why, when people return from their near-death experience, they say, I have a mission. I was told I have a mission. And I believe that each one of us perhaps maybe has a main mission and then maybe other, several missions. But if you could say one of my main missions is, this is my statement that I've formed: God has blessed me with challenges, heartaches, and struggles so I can develop the compassion to comfort and serve others in their own struggles. I was born with a neurological disorder, and yet I am high functioning. I was born with what's called complete agenesis of the corpus callosum. And to put that in layman terms, agenesis means something is not normal or something's not quite right. And the corpus callosum is a part of your brain that sits between your left and right hemisphere, and its purpose is to provide an information passageway from one hemisphere to the next. So the information needs to travel from the logical side to the more language or creative or emotional side, whatever it has the ability to do so quickly. I have what's called complete agenesis of the corpus callosum. That means my corpus callosum is completely missing. And it's a bundle of about 200 million or 180 million nerve fibers that make those syntax connections between the two sides. Well, how is it that that's completely missing and yet I'm high functioning? While my brain was forming in the womb, there was overabundance of spinal fluid that developed, and it blocked the corpus callosum from forming. And so our brain, the experts now know, is very plastic, and it went to work and tried to make up for the mistake and created random connections called Probst bundles. And so they're randomly in different parts of my brain, and where my corpus callosum is supposed to sit, there's just nothing there. So I guess you could say I have a hole in my head, but anyway, this disability through much of my life has caused social immaturity. They held me back from the normal, 6 years old going to first grade. So when I went to first grade at 7 years old, my birthday's in the summer, July, I was one of the older kids. My parents were hoping that maybe by that time I would catch up socially. Well, I didn't. My peers advanced socially far quicker than I did. And in my attempt to try to make friends, it would backfire on me. I would say something unknowingly that offended them, and I'd end up either getting beat up. And because I was one of the older kids in class, they would tease me and call me a retard and stuff like that. So if it wasn't physical abuse on a daily basis, it was emotional abuse. And so I was raised in a loving Christian home, but outside my home, I quickly learned that the world was cruel and abusive, from my perspective. And and my first grade teacher even would bust wooden yardsticks over my head. She'd get free yardsticks from the local hardware store where I grew up, and sometimes several times a week, she'd break them over my head. And I'm left-handed and stubborn, and she was trying to force me to be right-handed. And I would say things unknowingly, just, in a child, innocent way, and get beat for it. And I was just so frustrated. I couldn't understand why they were treating me that way, because I tried so hard to make friends, and it would backfire on me. And so when it came time for, I was turning 8 years old, and in my Christian tradition, baptizes around the age of 8. We do not believe in infant baptism. We believe that the children are innocent at birth and incapable of sin. And so by the time they become close to the age of accountability, and experts say that's around 8 years old, where they begin to form kind of a concept of basic right and wrong, that's when they baptize in my faith. And so after my birthday, or around the time of my birthday, between July and August, I went to my baptism, was baptized, and I started noticing it was subtle, it was kind of quiet, but it was there. There's some special feelings. It was like a warm blanket or a warmth in my chest, and it just felt like love and, acceptance. And I wondered one night, whether it was a few days or a few weeks after my baptism, I was thinking about that and thinking, oh crap, in a few weeks I'm going to have to go back to school. I don't want to face this. I was thinking, what I felt at my baptism, maybe that was God I felt. Maybe that was God's Spirit. And so as I was pondering on that, I was also thinking about, well, how am I going to, how am I going to get out of going to school again? I can't face school again after that awful experience. And I had begged my parents previously to let me stay home and play with my little brother, and they said, no, you have to go to school. It's the law. Back then they didn't. 1966, there was no charter school. I'm 63 now, by the way. And so, if I didn't go to school, my parents would be fined. And so they said I had to go. They held me back as long as they felt they could. But then finally, I was going to school, and here I was going to face another year. And so I knew my parents loved me, but I couldn't count on them and getting me out of that mess. I was just terrified to face again. So I thought, well, if that experience I had at my baptism, if that was God, and I'm going to share with you also an experience I had even earlier. It must have been somewhere between the age of 6 months and maybe to a year and a half. I don't know. If I had somewhat of a command of language, like say 1 or 2 words, maybe I could. But if I was closer to 6 months, likely not. But I just remember how frustrated I was because it just seemed like I wasn't getting my family's attention. My mom she was professionally trained in voice. She had a beautiful soprano voice. And, people were enthralled by her voice when she would sing. She actually studied in Hollywood for a few months and was considering going that direction. And in fact, Warner Brothers offered to hire her as an extra. And she was also going to trade voice lessons with the voice teacher who taught actors and actresses how to sing. This was about 1945 or 48, somewhere in between there. Mom was 19. And the voice teacher says, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll give you voice lessons. You be a nanny for my boys and help raise them, and you'll have a place to stay, you'll have food to eat, whatever. And then you'll also have a job at Warner Brothers while I'm teaching you, but you've got to be 100% dedicated to your acting and singing career. Family comes second. My mom's thinking was, well, it was mid-40s, the Depression had happened, and her family was quite poor, and she thought, well, she could help them out financially. And when they said, your family comes second, this was very disappointing to her, so she left Hollywood, went to college in Idaho, Ricks College at the time, met my father. They married, raised 7 children, and Mom would sing to us. She would sing at funerals, sing at church, and so on, and clubs and stuff, but she would sing to us nearly every day. And there was a period of time, maybe 3 or 4 months perhaps, where I saw people dressed in white, personages dressed in white, come to our home almost every day, it seemed, for that period of time, and surround my mom as she would sing beautiful songs to us. And I remember being frustrated, trying to express to my family, who are these people dressed in white who are coming into our home? And it seemed like I was the only one that noticed them, and after a while I just kind of got used to it. I thought, well, maybe these are family who had gone before. Maybe these are my ancestors. Somehow they were family. I seemed to understand that, and so I just accepted that after a while. But it seemed to last a few months, and then I didn't see them anymore. Well, I kept this to myself until, just a little over 5 years ago, before my mom passed away. I remarried. I'm married now, 22 years, just this November 26th, just the other day, or last week, was our anniversary, 22nd anniversary. I told someone for the first time, I told my wife about that experience, and she embraced it. She had already embraced the near-death experience I'm going to share with you. And so she readily embraced this as well, and believed me. And then just a few weeks later, and it was a few weeks before my mom passed away, I shared it with my mother. Now, my mother was the first person I shared my near-death experience with. And she told me that I asked her what that was, and she said, I don't know, but it was from God. It was definitely something very special. So she had believed me all these years, but yet I hadn't told her that experience. And when I shared it with my mom, she was in tears, just filled with so much joy. So not only was did people on this side of the veil enjoy her voice, but there were those on the other side of the veil. So I call that my STE, I guess you'd say, my spiritually transformative experience, if you want to put a label on it. Well, I was thinking about that night prior to going to bed and having my prayers, and about my baptism and what I felt there. And I thought, well, if those experiences, what I witnessed and what I felt were real, then God has to be real. And if anyone can help me out of this mess at school, he can. And so I got on the side of my bed in tears, and I pleaded with God in a childlike way. I said, Heavenly Father, the way I see it, either you've got to take this away somehow, this abuse at school, or take me away. And I said, I know it's wrong for me to take my life, but if you take me, then that's okay. And so I'm begging to end my mission on earth and let me go to a place where I knew I would be safe and loved. And then I climbed in bed and cried, and eventually started to sink into that feeling of deep sleep. And it was like everything just kind of blacked out, and my bed and the room started to spin like I was passing out. And the next thing I know, I felt this pull, and this between, from my, and I was floating above my bed outside my body. And I thought I was having a very conscious dream. At first, I thought, man, how strange. How can I be two places at once? This must be a dream. I'd look down and I'd see my body as appearing to rest peacefully in bed. And here I was outside of my body, floating on my back above my bed in the darkness. Now, I didn't have a tunnel experience, but I was in the darkness, and in the distance I could see this tiny bright light. And it was like a magnet. I was being pulled towards that light. And there was no sense of time, but it seemed like I traveled a great distance above the stars, past the stars, and eventually came to what appeared to be like a planet, I guess, surrounded in clouds. And as I got closer to those clouds, they parted, and eventually my weight shifted like I was going down rather than towards. And below me was this high mountainside and a forest grove of aspens mainly, and surrounded by, outside the aspen grove, pine trees and other plant life. But I was brought down into a clearing in that aspen grove, and the clearing was maybe 25 or 30 foot radius. I stood inside on one end of the clearing, and kind of in the middle, a narrow, organically straight pathway wound its way through the clearing. It came from some direction from behind me, maybe some higher, holier plane, and then went on to the other side into the thicket of the forest. And immediately I sensed that it was not anywhere on earth, that I was in some spiritual realm, perhaps some spiritual way station of some sort. And I knew that my prayer had been answered, and I thought, wow, God could have answered my prayer in any other way, and this is how he answered my prayer. And, for years I thought it was a dream, but if it was a dream, it was unlike any dream I've ever had before or since. because of what I felt. I've never felt the love of God before or since that experience in such the way that I did and so powerfully. And I noticed immediately that it was similar to what I felt at my baptism, but more magnified, maybe 10,000 times more. And I mean, how could you put words to that? You really can't. We don't have the language to describe such a thing. But I recognized that that's what I felt was what I would describe as the love of God. And so I knew my prayer had been answered, and I was filled with so much joy. And I had this sense also that even though I felt a distinct separation from my spirit and my body, which was laying in bed back in mortality, and here I was, a spirit in this spiritual realm, I still felt a connection to my body. In other words, I had this sense that I would eventually return to my body, that I was only there temporarily, that I would not be staying permanently. And I don't know how else to describe it. I was separated. I felt a distinct separation, and yet I felt this connection to my body. In other words, I wouldn't die permanently, but I would be going back. Well, I thought, well, this is such a cool experience. I'm going to make the best of it until I have to go back. So I'm going to soak up as much as I can. And while in that clearing, I saw colors beyond, I couldn't begin to describe them, beyond our prism here. I mean, we don't have the color palette here in mortality. How could you begin to describe colors that we don't have? And everything in the forest seemed to have its own vibration, all the plant life on the trees and the flowers and everything. And the vibrations seemed to be putting out kind of like music. I don't know how else to describe it, but it was just this enthralling, beautiful, heavenly music. It wasn't strange, but it was just unusual and unearthly, but not in a weird way. It's just beautiful. But each plant life had its own specific vibration, and that vibration put out a sound, and altogether it was like this beautiful harmony of music. All the plant life, the trees, the flowers, and everything was kind of swaying in the rhythm of that music, and the vibrations it was sending out, I sensed, was praising God for the measure of their creation, and it was continuous, ongoing. And also heard a choir of angels, I suppose. And which direction it was coming from, I wasn't sure. I guess it was all around me. I didn't see any angelic beings of any sort, but I could hear them. And they were also singing praises to their God. And also, while in the grove, I had this incredible downpourage of knowledge and experiencing how the earth was made, how the universe was made. I witnessed the creation and by what power it was made. And it was so amazing and so remarkable and beyond words. And yet it seems so simple that a child could understand it. And I remember thinking during that experience, hey, here I know how the world was created, and I'm now smarter than all those the scientists on Earth. And it's just simple to understand. And I thought, man, when I do go back, I can't wait to tell everybody what I've learned. Of course, when I did return, it was blocked from my memory. But having that intellectual, spiritual experience, I remember having that. I just don't remember the details. And so here I was having this amazing experience, and I thought, well, I'm just going to walk down that path and through the other thicket of the forest on the other side and see what else I can soak up before I have to return. And just before I stepped out of that clearing on the other side, there was this large stone to the right of the path on the edge of the clearing on the other side. It was about a boulder about waist high, and behind it was this cluster of aspens that were closer together, and one main one had this large trunk. I sensed from that one larger trunk that was symbolic. It was like the tree of life, which represented the love of God. And that whole experience I was having was about reassuring me with God's love, which is what I needed at the time. And so that aspen tree became a tree of life symbol to me, which represents the love of God. And you think about the aspen tree itself, it's kind of white, like pure, represents purity, and then it has those dark scars. And the Savior, he allowed his body to be marred. He died for us so that through him we can return to God's presence. And so it's like those dark scars on that aspen tree, the love of God represented the atonement of Christ. And one thing that's interesting about the aspen tree, if you didn't know, each aspen tree is not a single root system. It's a communal root. In other words, there's this giant root system that is all connected. All the aspens are connected to each other. They become one with each other. And during that experience, I was feeling this oneness with everything around me, and oneness with the love of God. And that was a very powerful symbol to me, which I didn't understand at the time, but I later understood in my life as I studied, other near-death experiences, which came about a decade later because it was 1966 and Raymond Booty's book didn't come out until around 1975 or 76. And so all I had to go by at the time was scriptures from my church, which I found some interesting things in. And I think it helped me grow spiritually, having that experience as an 8-year-old child, my near-death experience, and then reading the scriptures. It helped me develop a stronger spiritual sense, and that strengthened my belief in God as well. So I was just about to step out into the thicket of the forest, and I just got this really strong feeling that if one more step, that's the point of no return, and I'd have no choice but to go back to mortality. And I didn't want to go, and so I knelt down just inside that grove and leaned against a stone, put my hands in my face, and began to sob. And a few moments later, I felt this touch on my right shoulder. And then a voice said, "Russell, what's the matter? Why are you crying? What's wrong?" And I turned, curious that wherever that voice was coming from, that person knew who I was. I turned to see who touched me on my right shoulder, and I saw this personage with white hair and a white beard and a long flowing robe to just above his ankles and down to just above his wrists. And it was tied at his waist with a sash, kind of like a bathrobe, but it was white. And he had a white hair and a white beard. And as an 8-year-old boy, I was enthralled by his eyes. It seemed like his eyes, what I said to myself, his eyes appear to be on fire, and yet they're not. You could see eternity in his eyes, and you felt this love and this compassion and this acceptance and this trust. And he looked into my soul, and there was no fear coming from me because I knew immediately, before I saw his wounds in his hands and feet and his wrists, I knew immediately who that was. And I just allowed him to read my soul, and filled with so much understanding. And then he bent down to pick me up. And by the way, during this experience, it felt like deja vu, like I had been there before I came to Earth. And even though I was an 8-year-old child at the time, I also saw myself as a child between like 4 and 5 years old, somewhere around that age. And I sensed that symbolized my life before I was born. So it was like I was re-experiencing a moment with Christ, a very precious moment with Christ before I came to mortality, and having that experience with him at that very moment. So it was like two different time frames, periods of time at the same time. He reached down to pick me up and take me to his arms. And as he did so, his robe fell open a little bit, and I could see into his bosom, and I could see the wound in his side. And so he picked me up, and in a pillar of light, we transported. I don't know how to describe it, flew, transported, whatever. We transported up into the atmosphere to a distant city of light that was in the clouds, way far, far off, and no sense of time. It seemed like we traveled a great distance. But eventually, as we got closer to the city, to me it appeared that all the buildings, they appeared to be as if they were made of gold, but they were emanating, sending out these prisms of light. And again, the light prism was beyond our prism here. And the light itself seemed to be shouting praises to God for its existence. The light was God, but it was shouting praises. It was like it was alive. And now, I was born as a member of the Church of Jesus. I was baptized a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some non-LDS refer to us as Mormons, so that is actually our nickname, not our actual name of our faith. That was given to us by non-LDS, but our church is called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so I believe that when each of us have experiences such as this, they're even though we come from different faith traditions, or even not a faith tradition, maybe an atheist, but we have let's say we have some kind of a moral base. God gives us an individual experience, and yet there are all these similarities that kind of pull it together, and researchers say, okay, yeah, this was a near-death experience, or very much like a near-death experience, or out of body, because of all the similarities. And I believe those similarities as God's handprint. In other words, in the scriptures it says, out of the mouth of two or more witnesses shall my truth be established. Well, here, all these stamps of God's handprint on all these different near-death experiences saying, this is my handiwork, a kind of a way of saying that this came from God. But we come from different traditions, don't we? And mine was from an LDS background, and I was raised in Idaho, and sometimes we would travel through Utah. We would stop at the famous LDS Temple Square, and it became a family tradition, and so a favorite place for us to stop. And so as I was coming into that city, two of the buildings looked familiar to me. One was in the shape of the Salt Lake Temple, only it was gold. The other one was like the old Pioneer Tabernacle, only gold again. And the streets were paved in gold, it appeared, and the wall around the city appeared to be made of gold as well. But I was brought into the building like the tabernacle, and we were alone when we entered. We sat down on one of the pews. Now, in the original tabernacle, the pillars are painted it's pine, but it's painted to look like it's marble, so it's full painted. And at the time, the pioneers, they didn't have a lot of luxury things, and so, they painted things to look like fine stuff, like marble or finer wood than pine or whatever. Well, in my experience, during this experience, it was like the marble pillars were marble pillars, but yet it was alive. It was like the markings on the marble were moving. And it itself was alive and praising God. Well, we sat down on one of the benches near that pillar, and the Savior put his arm around me and wiped my tears and says, okay, Russell, let's talk about it. What's right? What are you afraid of? Why are you crying? And so I explained, I says, I know that I have to go back. But I said, this is my home here. Why can't I stay? And from my perspective, it was like I was just baptized. My slate's clean. It's the perfect time for me to be here. I'm clean. And so why can't I just stay? And I told him I was afraid that when it was my time to return, I will have messed up so bad that I wouldn't be able to come back. And the Savior chuckled at that, and he said, Russell, you don't need to worry about that. I've already taken care of that. Because I love you, I willingly allowed my body to be marred and suffer on a cross. I love you and all my brothers and sisters, so I willingly did that for you. And so all you have to do is just follow me and be a good boy and obey my commandments, and everything will be fine. And then he proceeded to tell me, like I was having an interview before I was born, before I came to mortality, and I believe each one of us had a interview specifically with Christ himself before we came to earth. I believe that we're filled with, we're excited about the experience we're going to have and the mission that God wanted us to perform and what we would experience in a physical body. But at the same time, I think we're all feeling very much, we're feeling anxiety too, because we had never been in a physical body. And so even though maybe we were taught about what it would be like and how we needed to be on earth and what our mission was and so on, we were taught things, we were schooled, yet we hadn't actually experienced that in a body ourselves yet. So we were, a little anxious. And I think I was feeling that. And so it was like the Savior was saying, reassuring me, as if I hadn't been born to earth yet. He says, Russell, you're going to be born into a good family who will love you, with good parents, and they will teach you about me and about my gospel. And you will develop a strong spiritual sensibility and come to know Christ and believe in Christ and believe in God and believe in his prophets. And then he said, and you will have the Holy Spirit with you, and that Spirit will warn you when there's danger and teach you right and wrong and so on. And he proceeded to say, you're going to have all these different tools. You'll have the scriptures that you can rely on and all these things I've given you. So really, you're not alone, and you'll have all these tools that will help you get back. So just, follow me and be a good boy, and you'll be fine. And then he said, it's time for you to go back. Are you ready? And I didn't really want to go, but I knew I could trust Christ. And so I said, yeah, I'm ready to go. He says, before you go, I want to make one last promise to you. I promise you that throughout your life, especially when times get really hard and you're feeling alone, I promise you that I will send messages of my life personally to you and let you know that I'm right there and that I love you. And so I was 8 years old. I'm 63 years old now, and I can testify with all the experiences I've had in my life, the ups and downs. He's been there every step of the way. He has let me know. And if there's time, I'll share some of those experiences. So I kind of call my experience reverse near-death experience, kind of like a reverse mortgage, where, those people who have died and come back, some of those can say, well, while I was dead, this and this and this happened, and I can confirm it. And sure enough, that's confirmed. The doctor said this, the nurse did this, they used this instrument or whatever. And or someone saw a red shoe on a roof, whatever, and it was confirmed in the hospital on top of the roof. Well, I have experiences that happened afterwards that were beyond coincidence, that have testified to me personally that God has kept his promise. And we returned back to that grove where my experience basically began, and he sat me down on the path on the one end, and I went towards that stone on the path towards that stone on the other end. And before we left, we hugged and embraced and kissed. And then he kind of gave me a little push on the rear and says, okay, it's time to go. And I walked down the path and into the thicket of the forest, and then I found myself back into my body. And it must have happened, it seemed like weeks or days or whatever. There's no sense of time. It seemed like the experience happened for quite a long time, but it was morning. The sunlight was shining in my room. So I came to the sense of my physical body and opened my eyes. And first I was thinking, oh man, that was so cool. And I was still feeling that love that I felt in his presence. That lingered with me. In fact, it stayed with me for the next maybe 3 or 4 months afterwards, and I believe that the Lord was allowing me to have that. It was constant, 24/7, as a gift, so that I could readjust back into the world, because I went to school, the abuse continued, but I had one thing now that I didn't have before, and that was the reassurance from God that He would be right there with me, that if no one else loved me outside my family, He does, and He did, and He would let me know. And it was like, okay, He's keeping His promise. I still feel that. He's letting me know. He's right here with me now. And so I couldn't wait to tell my family about all of the things I experienced. And I tried to recall experiencing the creation, because I wanted to, okay, now what was that? How do I tell this to my brothers and sisters and my family? And it was gone. It was just like, whoop, disappeared. It was out of there. So I was disappointed. But I knew I had this remarkable experience. And so at breakfast, I waited until all my siblings were gone and went to get ready for school or whatever they were doing. And so, yeah, it wasn't school yet. So they went on their way. And Mom was clearing the table. She and I were the only ones there. And I told her about my experience, and she immediately stopped what she was doing and sat down by me. And I shared this experience that I'm sharing with you now. I shared this with her. And she said, Russell, I said, what happened, Mom? She said, I don't know, but it was special, and it was from God. And I said, well, what does it mean? She says, I don't know, but someday maybe you'll understand. So it wasn't until about 10 years later when I started reading. I read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, and then I read George Ritchie's book, Return from Tomorrow, and Betty Eaton's book, and I read others throughout my life here and there, and I found similarities. But then I thought, well, but these people died, and I didn't die, but yet I had the same experience. And so how was that possible? And then I moved from Idaho to Utah after my first marriage ended, and found this group called Ions in Salt Lake City. And I found like-minded people who had a similar experience. And I've come to accept that what I had was an out-of-body experience, but it was so near-death-like, as you can tell from what I shared. Now people like Yvonne Kaysen, she puts a label on it as a near-death experience, because, it has a broader meaning, a broader term now than it did in the beginning when Raymond Moody first coined the phrase near-death experience. And so, whatever label you want to put on it, it was definitely from God, and it definitely had meaning, and I definitely separated from my body. I believe that now, and it couldn't have been anything else. And as I said, I've never had an experience like that before or since, and so how could it have been a dream? Because I've never felt that feeling in any other dream, and this was clear. And, it was just so clear and illuminating, where dreams are so random and they're based on your experiences that you have, in your life during the previous day or what you ate. This was not anything like that. This was a near-death-like experience, definitely. And one experience that I'd like to share with you that happened many years later, I was in my early 20s, and I got called to serve a mission to teach our Christian-based message to the people in the Bay Area, California, Bay Area. And prior to getting my being called a full-time missionary, I went to the temple to get what's called my endowments out, and then I would be endowed with power to go out and teach the gospel and so on. And and then I had gone to the temple several times after that, after I got married. And one time when I entered each temple, many of the temples they teach the story of the creation, about Adam and Eve, where we came from, and so on. and they teach the lessons of life and why we come here, and that Christ died for us and so on. It's centered around Christ's atonement. And in some of the temples, on some of the walls, it has like the creation room representing the Garden of the creation, and then a room representing a Garden of Eden, and then a room representing the world where mortality, and then a room. The final room is like the spirit world or celestial kingdom. And in the temple in Idaho Falls, I walked in after having my session. I walked into the celestial room. And I sat down in the middle of the room on a seat, and facing the entrances where I came in, the men come in on one side and the women on another, and in between, painted on the wall, was this cluster of aspen trees with a large boulder in front of one of those. And I thought, that's interesting. And I turned around to look the opposite side, where there are two other entrances into two seating rooms where people are married for time and all eternity. Painted on the wall in between was the same scene. And I thought, well, that's kind of like a portal. That represents kind of like a portal between spirit world and mortality. That's interesting. And then I saw to the right, to my left, I saw people painted on the wall that represent spirits in the celestial kingdom. And there was a group of people that was very, very personal to me. It wasn't part of my experience, but it reminded me of it, or it was personal, let's say that, is what I mean to say. There were two sitting down that looked older, but yet they looked like my mom's parents. Two standing up next to them that looked like they were my mom's parents when they were first married. So younger version of the two, younger and older version of my grandparents. And then my mom, a personage that looked like my mom, was sitting in the grass looking up at them and listening to them. And, so that was very personal to me. And then I looked in the upper right corner of that room on the wall facing opposite of where I came in. And there was a city in clouds. And two of the buildings that were represented, one looked like the Salt Lake Temple and one looked like the Tabernacle, and they were painted to look like they were made of gold, with light emanating from the clouds. And I thought, how interesting. This is, beyond coincidence. And so I went and found the temple president in his office after my session, and I asked if I could come into his room and share something with him, and he invited me to come in and sit down. And so I shared this experience that I just shared with you, this near-death experience, and I said, that was painted on the wall in the temple. And he said, Brother Ricks, first, I want to tell you that you're not the first person that's come to us because of that mural. Other people have had a similar experience that you're sharing. And I said, who are they? He says, I can't give you that information. I said, I understand. But what does it mean? He says, I don't know, but someday you'll understand. So that's what I was given until I finally have come to the understanding of what actually happened. So that's just one example of many experiences where I see the Lord in my life saying, Russell, you're doing good. I'm just checking in and letting you know I've made you a promise and I'm keeping that. And God never goes back on his words, I can tell you that. I'm letting you know that I love you and just hang in there, keep doing what you're doing, So, and I've had other experiences, since, but they're all kind of similar to that. And that's the one that kind of stands out the most. So now there's one more I'd like to share with you, which happened just a little over 5 years ago before my mother passed away. And as I mentioned, that experience I had earlier in my childhood, where I saw these personages dressed in white come into our home and surround Mom as she would sing. I had not shared it with her or anyone until just a few months before my mom passed away. I shared it with my second wife. And then I shared it with my mom. And, the time came for my mom. She passed away a little over 5 years ago. And during the last week, the last few days before she died, I would come and visit her as often as I could. and, which was quite a few times during the week prior to her death. And in between my second job, I worked for an essential oils company in a warehouse nearby, and she was in an assisted living home. And she confided in me and said, "Russell, I'm afraid to die." And I said, "Oh, Mom, why are you afraid?" I said, "You fulfilled your mission while you were here in mortality. You've done what you were sent to do. You were the best mom that your children and grandchildren and best grandma that your children and grandchildren could ever have." And I said, "Not just anyone can be married to Dad, and you were, perfect for him, and you fulfilled your role as a wife too." I said, "What do you have to be afraid of?" I said, "You remember that experience I had as a child?" And she says, "I remember." Excuse me, I'm a little teary-eyed. I remember. And I said, "Well, you have nothing to be afraid of. It is so beautiful over there and so filled with so much love." And I said, "We all have regrets in our life." And I said, "What's going to happen is you may have what they call a life review. You might see your life flash before your eyes, but you're not going to see anything you're going to have to worry about. And even if you do, by the end of it, God will look at you and say, I love you. It's perfect. I accept you, and come into my bosom, come into my kingdom." And so I did it. I did everything I could to reassure her. And then a few days later, I came back, and she saw me entering the room. She goes, "Hi, Russell." And then she looks up with a smile, looks above her bed, up towards the ceiling, and points up at the ceiling with a smile. And she said, "Russell, I'm no longer afraid." And during that visit, she started calling out to her mother. She said, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, are you there?" Something like that. And I thought, well, okay, her mind's starting to go. She's acting like a child, so it's starting to deteriorate. That was my thinking. And then also during that visit, she sang a song. Her voice had gotten quite a bit older, so it wasn't like it was when she was much younger. But there was a song at our church that it was called Primary. So the teens and adults would go, the older kids and the adults would go to Sunday school. Well, the children, 3 to 11, would go to what was called Primary, which was a Sunday school for younger kids. And during the primary session, they would teach songs to the kids to sing. And one of those songs was a popular one I still remember. I looked out the window, and what did I see? Popcorn popping on the apricot tree. Spring has brought me such a nice surprise. Popcorn popping right before my eyes, and so on and so forth. So my mom sang to me. I looked out the window, and what did I see? And then she turned to look at me with curiosity in her eyes, and she said, "What do you see?" And, she kept doing that over and over and over again. And I thought, okay, she's just being a little 5-year-old, and I'll just, love her and accept her and go along with it. And she kept pushed. I finally said, okay. After several times, I finally said, okay, I look out the window and I see a brick wall. I see a tree. I see grass. And it didn't occur to me until weeks after she passed away what she was trying to ask. She was trying to confide in me. Do you see what I see? Her mother had visited her, and maybe others. And I did not see them at that time, but she was hoping that I would, so she could confirm that she wasn't crazy because of the experience I shared with her a few weeks prior to that, and the experience I had when I was 8 years old. Well, like a few weeks later had passed, or a week had passed, and I get this call from my sister Becky while I was at work. And she said, "Russell, I think this is it. I think Mom's in her final hours, and I don't want to be here alone when she dies. Can you come and be here with me?" And the warehouse where I worked was just a few blocks away. And so I said, "I'll see if I can get permission." And I got permission, and I came. It was around 8 o'clock that evening. And then after a while, my sister said, "I've been sitting by Mom's side since early this morning, and I think it's your turn to take her side. So I did, and I held her hand. And immediately when I walked into that room, and this you could call my shared death experience, part of it, the beginning of it, I walked into that room and I immediately sensed the presence of three distinct personages in that room besides my sister Becky and I and my mother. Personages from the other side of the veil. I did not see them, but I surely felt them. And it was powerful. And there it was, that familiar love of God feeling that I felt as an 8-year-old boy at my baptism, and many times off and on here and there throughout my life when God says, I'm right here, I'm just keeping my promise and letting you know. There it was again, but along with that distinct acknowledgement that there were three personages there. And I believe that those personages were my mom's parents, who had passed on when I was 17 years old. They were both killed in a head-on in a car collision. And my father, who had passed away in 1996 at the age of 66, just 3 years older than I am now. He died too young, and he didn't take very good care of his health. But there the three of them were, I believed, there with Mother, waiting to escort her home when her final moments came. And then around 2:30 something in the morning, I can't remember exactly what time it was, but it was around that time. During that whole time, Mom had been unresponsive. At first, she was breathing heavily, like they do when their organs start shutting down. And then she became more and more unresponsive, except for every once in a while, Becky would say, would you like some ice or anything? And Mom would you could barely nod her head. It was, she could almost not nod her head, but it was just so weak. But so we'd hold ice up to her mouth and put it in, and she would accept it. But that's about all we could do. And then after holding her hand for several hours, she suddenly opened her eyes around 2:30 something in the morning and looks at me, and then swiftly turns to her left and looks up with this look of surprise and joy and elation in her eyes and her mouth, like she was going, like that with surprise. And then her spirit slipped away. She took her last breath, and the moment she took her last breath and her spirit slipped, her body sank, the presence that I felt of those three other personages left with her. So that's a very sacred experience for me, and I'm still, sensitive by that because it was just 5 years ago. And this whole thing is kind of hard to share, but I'm willing to do it because there are people that need to hear my story. And by the way, I have a book that was published in 2017. It's called Remember, A Little Boy's Near-Death Experience. That's the title of my book, and I'm Russel Ricks. And you can, I'm not sure if it's out of print now, but you can get it on, you may be able to get it on Amazon, or you can go to my publisher, cedarfortpublishing.com. So it's available there if you'd like to read my full story. Well, let me share one more thing real quick. A couple of years ago, I got this message from someone on social media, on Facebook. About a year before that, I was on a podcast with a host called Kirsty Salisbury, and she's from New Zealand. She has a pretty strong New Zealand accent, and so I was also born with a hearing loss besides my ACC, and we were doing it over the phone like this, so it was kind of a challenge for me. But clear across the other side of the world in New Zealand, this person contacted me, and she says, "Are you the Russel Ricks that's had a near-death experience, and you were on a podcast with Let's Talk Near Death with Kirsty Salisbury?" And I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "Well, I just want you to know that I heard your experience, and I was struggling at the time, and I was considering taking my life. And so I prayed to God, and then I got on the internet and found your podcast and heard it live. And I just want you to know that when I was about the same age, I had a near-death experience. It was short, but it was a near-death experience. And I was also born with complete agenesis of the Corpus Callosum. And you have given me hope. So if my book was printed for that one person, it was worth it. So I know that there are people out there that can benefit from this story, and that was an example of one of them. So, and that meant a lot to me to hear back from her.